Before we get to the views of the New Testament writers themselves regarding the Deuterocanon, I'd like to briefly sample the history of Bible canons down through time, just to give an idea not only of the widespread acceptance of the Deuterocanon, but also the tremendous variety of canons that continue to exist well up until the time of the Reformation, when the canon debate would reach its peak, but which would still not be settled with anything close to an overwhelming consensus, despite the widespread modern belief that there has always been a consensus. You might think that the ancients would have left us book lists of what books belong in the Bible, but we don't find these starting until the 2nd century onward. Even the Bible itself does not contain a single book list, although it often references specific books as Scripture, though many books in the Bible are never referenced by other books in the Bible as Scripture. It seems likely that the reason we don't find book lists until relatively late is because ancient views of canon were greatly different than our own, especially regarding the closure of the canon, as I've already partially covered earlier in this series. But right now, I only want to focus on one very interesting fact. We do not find a book list containing only the 27 books of our modern New Testament until hundreds of years after Christ, and we don't find a book list referencing the Hebrew Bible as used by modern Jews and Protestants until even later. So we don't have any book lists in the earliest days of the Bible. What evidence do we have for what books people believe were Scripture? In my book, I go into the earliest book counts and the tripartite division of Scripture, for which we have earlier evidence. Another evidence for what people viewed as Scripture is what they alluded to and quote as Scripture. We'll see some of this evidence in a moment. Another type of evidence are the earliest collections of Scripture that we still have physical evidence for. Let's consider a few examples of those here. Around the time of the Reformation, nearly 2 millennia after the Deuterocanon was first written, the movement to go back to the sources was in full swing. Bible scholars wanted to go back to the original languages. They did not, however, reject all tradition, to be sure. In fact, one could even argue that the Reformers were quite slow in rejecting tradition. For instance, the Vulgate, which was a much earlier 4th century attempt to return to the Latin, was still heavily influenced by the Septuagint. Even when translators during the Reformation made a conscious effort to use the Hebrew Bible rather than the Greek Septuagint, they would still be heavily influenced by earlier translations, as I cover in my book. For example, the King James translators were heavily influenced by earlier English translations such as Wycliffe and Tyndale's. And in their preface, they're completely open about the fact. Just as many Protestant churches would preserve some of their Catholic heritage, such as in similar church organization and worship service, rejection of the Deuterocanon was slow as well. The initial printings of the King James Bible contained it until finally it was removed in later printings. But Protestants would eventually mostly reject the Deuterocanon, though not all of them. For the Old Testament, the history of the preference for Hebrew books over Greek ones goes back to such writers as Josephus, Melito, and Jerome. But the argument that the Greek books should be rejected simply because they are later and in Greek should at least be questioned by Christians, since it was their Greek New Testament that would become their key to unlocking the Hebrew Scriptures. I already mentioned the library at Qumran as evidence for belief in many deuterocanonical works written in the 3 centuries before Christ, but here I want to focus on the first modern books. The modern book is called a codex and is a stack of pages bound on one side like a hinge. You may not think of this as a technological innovation, but it actually was, and quite a tremendous one at that. It allowed you to more quickly access information. Think of the older scroll like a cassette tape that you had to wind to get to where you wanted to go. But a codex is more like a digital recording. It allows you to jump straight to where you want to read. Some of the earliest adopters of the codex were in fact Christians, and some scholars have even speculated that Christians were the ones who popularized the modern book because it allowed them to take full advantage of the intertextual nature of the Bible. For example, when the New Testament argues that Isaiah was predicting Jesus, early Christians could quickly use a codex to jump between passages to make their arguments. Before the advent of cheap paper resulted in a commercially viable printing press that helped kick off the Reformation and the Information Age, codices were extremely expensive. All forms of writing in the ancient world, in fact, were extremely expensive. It boggles the modern mind that until the last few hundred years, most believers would not have owned a Bible. A complete Bible would have been especially very expensive to produce in the earliest centuries, and for one to survive to the present day, even much rarer. So we are quite fortunate to have 3 complete or nearly complete Bibles from the 4th and 5th centuries. These are often called the Big Three, and they are the Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Alexandrinus, and Codex Vaticanus. Codex Sinaiticus dates to the 4th century. In addition to the usual core 39 books of the Old Testament that are universally accepted, this ancient Bible includes Tobit, 2nd Esdras, Judith, 1st through 4th Maccabees, Sirach, and Wisdom of Solomon. Note that this is a few more than the Catholic canon today, and the New Testament of Codex Sinaiticus contains the Shepherd of Hermas and the Epistle of Barnabas. Codex Alexandrinus is a Bible from the 5th century and includes Baruch, the letter of Jeremiah, Tobit, 1st and 2nd Esdras, Judith, 1st through 4th Maccabees, Sirach, Wisdom of Solomon, and Psalm 151. Note that this Deuterocanon is nearly twice the number of deuterocanonical books found in modern Catholic Bibles. And unlike many modern Bibles with the Deuterocanon placed at the end of the Old Testament, in Codex Alexandrinus, these are mixed throughout the Hebrew Bible. The New Testament also contains 1st and 2nd Clement and Psalms of Solomon. Codex Vaticanus is a Bible from the first half of the 4th century. This Bible was kept by the Vatican from most public access until only a couple of centuries ago. It includes Baruch, the letter of Jeremiah, Tobit, 1st and 2nd Esdras, Judith, Sirach, and Wisdom. Interestingly, it is missing 1st through 4th Maccabees and the Prayer of Manasseh, which would end up in the Vulgate. In the New Testament, it is also missing the pastoral epistles, traditionally attributed to Paul, which are the letters to Timothy and Titus, and it's missing Philemon. And since there are missing pages from the end, it's possible that it never included Revelation, although we're not sure about that, and that some apocryphal New Testament books might have been included at the end as well, but have since been lost. But these so-called Big Three earliest complete Bibles are not the only evidence we have of what books people in the earliest centuries of Christianity believed were canonical. Even shorter manuscripts can tell us a great deal about beliefs regarding canon. Here are only a few examples. Codex P72 is dated to the 3rd or 4th century and is the oldest text of Jude and 1st and 2nd Peter, and it also contains Psalms 33 and 34. But apart from those generally accepted canonical books of the Bible, it also contains Nativity of Mary, the 11th Ode of Solomon, and the Apology of Philos. Codex Claromontanus, from around the 5th or 6th century AD, contains a list of the books of the Old and New Testaments. Interestingly, it does not include Philippians or 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, but it does in fact include the Epistle of Barnabas, Acts of Paul, Shepherd of Hermas, and the Revelation of Peter. The biblical text of the Oxyrhynchus Papyri includes some New Testament books, along with the Apocalypse of Baruch, the Gospel of Thomas, and the Shepherd of Hermas. In addition to multiple books of the Hebrew Bible, these manuscripts also include 2nd Baruch, 2nd Esdras, Tobit, Sirach, Enoch, and Wisdom. These date from the 3rd to the 5th centuries AD. One of the most famous manuscripts related to the canon is the damaged and incomplete Muratorian fragment, which many scholars date to the late 2nd century, though a minority view dates it as late as the 4th century. It's intended as a list of accepted New Testament books, but it omits Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, and one of the Johannine epistles. And it includes the Book of Wisdom and the Apocalypse of Peter. And the author, despite supporting it, informs us that the Apocalypse of Peter was not allowed to be read in some congregations. Apart from actual manuscripts of the biblical books or lists, another way we can know what books believers considered canonical were the writings of early church fathers. Athanasius, who lived in the 4th century, gives us the very first list of books that corresponds exactly to our 27-book New Testament canon. And he includes 7 deuterocanonical books with the core 39 books of the Hebrew Bible. But his views were not universal even in his own time. For instance, Eusebius, an older contemporary of Athanasius, tells us that several of the New Testament books were disputed, which includes James, Jude, 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, and Revelation. Wisdom is quoted by both Irenaeus and Tertullian, who lived in the 2nd century, and by Epiphanius, who lived in the 4th century. Various groups of Jewish Christianity persisted until the 5th century and accepted different Jewish Christian gospels, which have since been lost. but we do have quotes from some of them in the writing of the so-called early church fathers such as Clement, Eusebius, Origen, Epiphanius, and Jerome, who speak of the gospel of the Hebrews. Now, what can we conclude from all this evidence? Firstly, there were in fact a core set of books that were usually considered canon. These are the 39 of the Christian Old Testament. However, there was even sometimes debate over a few of these, such as Ezekiel, Ruth, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, and Esther, which never mentions God explicitly. And regarding the New Testament canon, there's even less earlier consensus on the core books that would eventually make up the 27-book canon. No list before the 4th century contained all 27 New Testament books, and a few did after that period for a while. Secondly, there was never universal agreement on certain books on the so-called fringes of the canon. As we've seen, collections of the deuterocanonical books in the Hebrew Bible tended to be slightly different both in their contents and in the order in which they were placed in the Bible. In the New Testament, once again, there's even more variety exhibited for books which were eventually excluded from the canon. An interesting side note is that pretty much all of these oldest codices that exhibit such variety were either totally unknown until the last couple of hundred years or were unavailable to the public, as was the case with the Codex Vaticanus. So far, we've looked at only evidence for canons in the first few centuries of the Church, but now I'd like to move forward in time to show how there were still fluctuations in the canon. Let's begin with the Catholic Church's Latin Bible, the Vulgate. In addition to the 7 Catholic books of the Deuterocanon that we've already covered in a previous lesson, earlier editions of Jerome's Vulgate would contain the Prayer of Manasseh, 1st and 2nd Esdras, and Psalm 151, and, in the New Testament, the Epistle to the Laodiceans. These would be excluded from the Catholic Bible after the Council of Trent as late as the 16th century. But that did not stop the use of the deuterocanonical works outside of the approved 7 of the Catholic Church. Even after the Reformation, as late as the 17th century, the early editions of the Protestant King James Bible would be printed with modern Catholics' 7 books, plus 1st and 2nd Esdras and the letter of Jeremiah. Jerome is often cited as opposing the Deuterocanon, but what he actually says is more nuanced than outright rejection of it. He mentions questions regarding the canonicity of some of the books of the Deuterocanon, but defends himself, for instance, for merely repeating Jewish arguments against including the additions to Esther and Daniel. Yet he refrains from giving his own actual opinion, but defers to the tradition of the churches of including them. Another interesting tidbit he gives us is that the Jews of his time did accept Judith, but despite this, he leaves it in his Latin translation. Once again, he mentions church tradition as his reason. The influential Wycliffian translation in the Middle English of the 14th century was based on the Vulgate, and it would include 7 apocryphal books that would remain in the Catholic Bible to the present, plus the Prayer of Manasseh, 1st Esdras, and the Epistle to the Laodiceans. The Septuagint would remain the dominant Bible used in the East, and as we've seen, their version of it would contain several more deuterocanonical books than the Catholic Bibles of today. As you can see, canon variety persists well into the time of the first few editions of the King James Bible in the 17th century, and some of the earliest attempts to remove the Deuterocanon would go to even further extreme of even questioning some of the 27 books of the New Testament, as was the case with Martin Luther, who voiced strong objections to some of them, such as James, whose comments on works conflicted with Luther's understanding of Paul's teaching on saving faith apart from works. Luther, in his famous German translation of the New Testament, moved the following books to the end of the New Testament and mainly only included them because of church tradition: Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation. Now that we've seen this sampling from the extensive evidence for quite a variety of canons down through the millennia, I'd like to dispense with a myth that often gets repeated in lessons on the canon. One often repeated misconception is that canons were established at certain councils. For example, you might hear that the Council of Jamnia in the 1st century established the final form of the Hebrew Bible, but scholars now recognize that this was more accepted by the repetition of it by quote-unquote experts than the actual historical evidence. And in the last couple of decades, the idea that the New Testament was established at the Council of Nicaea in 325 has virtually no historical support. We actually know exactly what was discussed at that council, and because they documented it, it wasn't the canon of the New Testament. This misconception arose mainly from Dan Brown's novel, The Da Vinci Code, funnily enough. Later councils did in fact debate the canonicity of certain books, but their various decisions were about books already in use by the church. They did not by any means establish the canons; those had already taken root. Nor did the councils that actually debated the canonicity of certain books somehow settle the debates. For instance, we know that some Jews considered Sirach to be canonical after Jamnia, while Esther was excluded by many, but it would later be included, while Sirach was excluded. And for Christians, the book of Revelation was not included by the Greek Orthodox until around 1000 AD, and it is still not accepted by the Syriac Church. Now we turn to whether the New Testament authors viewed any of the Deuterocanon as authoritative in the next lesson.